This kid with a lot of hair showed up and ran for Congress in the 3rd District in Northwest Arkansas. Most people hadn't heard of him, and he came within a whisker, very close to unseating an incumbent Republican congressman up there that everyone assumed was unbeatable. His name was Bill Clinton. He didn't win the election, but you could argue that he won it, because when that campaign was over, he was not just known in the 3rd Congressional District, he was known statewide. Wow, here's a comer.
Bill Clinton made his first race for Congress the old-fashioned way, and he kept doing it. He traveled the state, had a driver, went around, went to every crossroads in the state, and shook hands. I think by the time Bill Clinton left office in Arkansas, if you hadn't met Bill Clinton, it wasn't because you didn't try. He was that close to the people. And he had a skill about him. He remembered people, he looked people in the eye, and for a moment made contact, and people walked away from him saying, boy, that guy's something special.
He could walk down a line of individuals in a small town in Weiner, Arkansas, or Mark Tree, or Pine Bluff, or wherever, and shake your hand and remember your name, and maybe remember your wife's name, and that your son was in college, and I think that that ability to do that also explains why Clinton was frequently late for where he was going, because wherever he went, he took the time to address each individual that he encountered in that sort of personal way.
In the flash of an eye, he was Attorney General. In the flash of an eye, he was governor. In the flash of an eye, he was a former governor, ousted. Happened before they knew what hit him.
Bill Clinton came to office as governor in 1979 with a big agenda. He was going to really be a world changer. And of course, he came to grief because of that. They moved, I think, by everybody's agreement later, much too fast. He came across as brash, cocky, arrogant. His staff did as well. They went to work on such things as clear cutting, making instant enemies out of the very powerful timber industry by doing that. He raised car tax fees. The location of Cuban refugees at Fort Chaffee, of course, became a huge disaster for his administration. It was something he couldn't do anything about, but they rioted. He was blamed for it because there was a Democratic president. And then Frank White was a pretty canny campaigner. He took advantage of these things. He filmed some pretty tough ads that really hurt Clinton. And I think a lot of people voted against Clinton just as sort of a protest vote. And I think it's true what was said, is a lot of people woke up the next day and said, gee, if I'd known he was going to get beat, I wouldn't have voted for Frank White. There was a great deal of that sentiment, but nonetheless, Frank White won.
He didn't win by a crushing majority, but Frank White had ousted the golden boy of Arkansas politics, Bill Clinton. A governor, a sitting governor, had been denied a second term. A seismic shock.
So in early 1981, Bill Clinton is an ex-governor. He is 34 years old, and he's already out of his job. And Bill Clinton clearly wanted to reclaim his political career. He wanted to come back in Arkansas. And so in 1982, as he begins to think about this comeback campaign, he and his advisors decide that what needs to happen is that he needs to go on TV in his first television advertisement, and he needs to apologize to the people and tell the people of Arkansas he respects them and he'll never do them wrong again.
It was really a remarkable video performance. Never before, the circumstances were new, of course, but you had a former governor going on television at no small expense, apologizing for having blown it in his first term. Apologizing. I didn't listen to you very well, and I'm sorry. I hurt you in some ways economically, and I'm sorry. It was a new thing. That was kind of remarkable. It worked. It set the stage.
And so that's the kickoff to that 1982 comeback campaign, is this apology to the people of Arkansas. And by all accounts, very effective re-entry for Bill Clinton. But it wasn't going to be easy. He faced tough competition in the primary of '82. He had to face a runoff campaign, and then he had come back and defeat now the incumbent governor who had defeated him 2 years ago. But he does all that, he succeeds, and he does gain his first big comeback as governor of Arkansas in 1982. By the time he left Arkansas for Washington, Bill Clinton would be one of the 3 longest serving Arkansas governors. And in 1990, he won his last race for re-election. But it was certainly not clear that he was going to win that last race. And I think it's important to recognize, you know, if he had failed in 1990, Bill Clinton clearly would have never become president. It was not clear what Bill Clinton was going to do in 1990. It was not clear if he was going to run for re-election. The Arkansas primary election is in May of 1990. He doesn't make his announcement about what he's going to do until March of 1990, just a little over 2 months before that primary date. But on that day, he comes out and he says, I've decided that indeed I still do have the passion to be governor of the state. There are still things to do, and I want to run for re-election. But by then, other folks had already said, this guy's vulnerable. People are tired of this guy, and this guy can be beaten. One of the strongest of the Democratic candidates was already gone from the scene by the time that Bill Clinton made his announcement. The Attorney General of the state, Steve Clark, had been seen as the next in line for the governorship. Steve Clark had been Attorney General for a number of years, had been, by all accounts, a successful, non-offensive Attorney General, and so he was clearly next in line. But what came to light as he began his governor's campaign was that he had been using the state credit card for a number of personal expenses. And so Steve Clark has to leave the race and ultimately goes to federal prison over those charges. The second very viable candidate is Jim Guy Tucker. Jim Guy Tucker is clearly the one who has the potential to beat him in the eyes of those around Clinton. And so some of those advisors go to Jim Guy Tucker and convince him that he should leave the race and that they will do all they can to help pay the debt that he had built up in that governor's race to date and do all they can to win the lieutenant governorship if he will step back and instead run for that lower level race. And that's what Jim Guy Tucker does, and he does become lieutenant governor after 1990. The third candidate is the grandson of a former governor, Tom McCray, who had been successful in economic development, and so he wants to be governor as well. And while Bill Clinton doesn't win an impressive primary win, he wins a solid win in 1990 and doesn't suddenly look as wounded as many thought early in that year. The sharpest Republican political mind of the 1980s and early 1990s was a guy named Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was a South Carolina political consultant who had been a vital ingredient in George Bush's election as president in 1988. As President Bush kind of prepared for his re-election campaign in 1992, Lee Atwater looked around America and thought about who might be the people who would be most dangerous as Democratic candidates, and he thought Bill Clinton of Arkansas was a guy who really could do harm to George Bush if he got in the race and got the Democratic nomination. And so the Atwater political team in the White House decides that the best bet was to try to take Bill Clinton out in Arkansas. And so as part of a broader Southern-wide campaign to get sitting Democrats to switch to the Republican Party, they go out and recruit the congressman from Central Arkansas, Tommy Robinson, a true conservative populist, to become a Republican. And so there's a high-profile White House press conference in which Tommy Robinson says, I'm not leaving the Democratic Party has left me, and conservative Democrats like me. And so he becomes kind of the front runner for the Republican nomination for the governorship. Ultimately, Tommy Robinson wasn't the only Democrat who switched to being a Republican and decided they wanted to be governor. A guy named Sheffield Nelson, also a longtime Democrat who had thought of running for governor as a Democrat, was one of the most high-profile business leaders in the state. And he decides he's going to be governor as well. And he suddenly is a well-financed opponent to Tommy Robinson in the Republican primary. And so Sheffield Nelson's campaign makes a real appeal to get Democrats to come into the Republican primary, vote for Sheffield Nelson, and thus take away that Robinson threat. And so the combination of Nelson's appeal to traditional Republicans and his campaign's appeal to get Democrats to come into that primary and vote against Tommy Robinson was ultimately successful. Thus, one of the biggest upsets of the 1990 election was the fact that Tommy Robinson's campaign for governor never got off the launching pad because he got stopped in the Republican primary by the folks who came out and voted for Sheffield Nelson.
As no governor before him, he brought African Americans into government in ever-increasing numbers, which bolstered his already remarkably strong emotional bond with African American voters in Arkansas and, as you later saw, elsewhere. And he did succeed in making public education a big priority, putting it on the front burner of the public's consciousness, and I think keeping it there. Had a little help from the courts, and I think he made some improvements in social services. But by and large, a lot of that tenure was spent laying the groundwork for a presidential campaign. So while I'm not at all confident that you can say he was a great governor, he was a good governor, and he was not a bad governor. He was a remarkable governor.
Well, I think the test of Bill Clinton will be time and history. I think his time outside of office proves what an enormous figure he is. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say he's the most popular man in the world today. He is a marvel. He's a political marvel.